How many of you have seen that scene before? Familiar with it? So you've all heard the song, I'm sure. So why did I just show you that? Why do I start out like this other than for dramatic effect? What you just witnessed is a great user experience. It met the user's specific needs, meaning that the bone did exactly what he needed it to do. It was simple to use. It was joyful to use. He's having a lot of fun smashing stuff to death. And it seamlessly merged with existing ways of working, meaning that that bone was an extension of something his body couldn't do, couldn't break through all of that stuff. The reason that I showed that scene is, number one, it's widely considered one of, if not the most important scene in cinema because of how groundbreaking it was from an effects standpoint, from a cinematography standpoint, and it was bridging art cinema to science fiction. And we go through that a lot in what we do in user experience design, and that's kind of where we're at right now. We're in this interesting phase where what we did for a long time was very academic in a lot of circles of discussion, and what we do now is in the mainstream. And that is what we're going to talk about. So my name is Brad Weaver. I'm the Chief Experience Officer at 9 Labs in Atlanta, Georgia. We're a user experience consulting practice directly to client services, and we have a couple of products and apps that we work on as well. And if you haven't already guessed, I love movies. I love movies so much that I've made them, I've been in them, I've worked on them, and I've done lots of cool things over the years. I've had the chance to be behind the camera, in front of the camera on both a $10 movie and a $100 million movie, and it's a pretty similar experience across the board when you really boil it down to what we do. These are my 10 favorite movies ever. It's a bit of an icebreaker. These are not the 10 best movies ever made. There's a big difference between favorite and best, right? And we would say the same thing about what we do for a living. Is you have your favorite things that you get to interact with, and you have the best things that you get to interact with. But these are my 10 favorite movies. And this is my favorite scene in any movie.
I like your nurse's uniform, guy.
These are OR scrubs.
Oh, are they? Well, they're totally...
That's my favorite movie of all of that list is Rushmore. It's a Wes Anderson film, and we'll come back around to Wes Anderson in a little while. But I do say with definitive declaration that this is the greatest movie ever made, and I will fight you if you disagree, which is The Empire Strikes Back, because it is the most entertaining movie, and it is one of the best movies ever made. So yes, I love movies. I also love UX design. I get to do it for a living. I chose it for a career over film, which was a career I could have pursued, and I have no regrets about it. But I get to bring them together every once in a while, which feels a little bit like this, or probably more like this. And that's what I get to indulge in when I talk to you guys about this. But the reality of it is that I have learned over the years in working in both of these worlds that making a film is very similar to running a user experience project and not a forced archetype or analogy. There's some really practical stuff with what's going on with film. Because the reality is there's 100 different ways to make a film or a UX project, and it's rarely the same from one to the other. It's kind of why we like what we do, is that we don't do the same thing over and over again. Even if you're a researcher and you have a particular methodology that you apply, every client, every subject, and every process is different every time. And that's very similar to filmmaking. Not a lot of other careers out there like that. When you're an accountant or a factory worker or anything else, you know, it's kind of mundane, and it's why we like what we do. But because you do things 100 different ways, you end up with 1,000 different outcomes, which is why a lot of times when you watch the trailer for a movie or you read the description, they think at the studio, the actors that are in it, and you as the viewer think, this is going to be the greatest movie ever made, and it's terrible. Or you see something and you go, that looks terrible, and it ends up being a fantastic movie. It's the old sports saying, that's why they play the games. And it's the same thing with what we do in UX and design. And I think by looking at the film industry, what we can do is we have a bit of our own crystal ball, because they predate us by about 60 years for what they do and what we do today. And we can learn a lot about where we've been, where we are right now, and where we're going through understanding what they've been through as an industry. So dive with me for a bit here into a second about the film industry, and I promise this will come back around, but this is the fun part. So studio versus independent film. In the past, you had two ways that movies were made. You had these big studios, and then you had smaller and independent films. But for the most part, studio films were being consumed by the masses, meaning a person in, rural Washington or rural Iowa, for the most part, consumed studio films. And you had independent films that were made often, but they were seen very infrequently. It was something that was very reserved for either New York or art house or something else like that. And it's important to note that independent film is not the same thing as art house film, which when you think of like French cinema or Italian cinema, that is film as art. What we're talking about is independent film, very much in the American sense, which is a literal or a linear story, a plot, characters, beginning, middle, and end resolution. That's not the same thing as what you would consider French film, which dates back to the late 1890s, early 1900s, which I still don't get to this day, and I think I'm a pretty smart person. So here's a brief history of how independent film happened and why it exists. And I know this is hard to read, but it's here for me, more not for you. So in 1908, you had a thing called the Edison Trust established, which is named after Thomas Edison, who invented the film camera that's used in most films. And what it basically said is if you don't make a film inside its studio system, you're blacklisted. So you can't put movies out if you don't do them in the studio system. And that lasted for 11 years, and it was pretty rock solid until a man named Charlie Chaplin, who you've most heard of, established United Artists, which was the first independent film studio. And it was a group of actors and directors. Charlie Chaplin typically acted and directed in his own films. And so we're going to make our own stuff. Screw you guys, we're doing it anyway. And out of that studio, films like The Great Dictator and other just groundbreaking films came out of United Artists. In 1939, you had Gone with the Wind, which is from my hometown of Atlanta, made. It was the first big-budget independent film. And Gone with the Wind shattered everyone's expectations. It went over budget. It was overblown. It was too long. All of the things that could go wrong with a film that normally wouldn't happen with an independent film when you think of small happened here. And it wasn't a runaway success from day one, but eventually it became the institution that it is today. And, of course, it's very well respected and liked. In 1959, a man named John Cassavetes made a movie called Shadows. This is the first, what you think of when you think of an independent movie, that slightly weird, slightly off-balance film that's like, this is different than something made for the masses, kind of bridging that art house feel to a linear storytelling thing. And it's a great film. It still holds up. And then you had avant-garde, which is like Andy Warhol and those type of people that started making really interesting films in the mid-'60s. That led into El Topo, which is the first what you would call like a B movie, which is a whole different genre of independent film. So that's like your midnight movie, your Rocky Horror Picture Show, that kind of stuff. Like, it's bad, but it's intentionally bad. And that kind of started in 1970, and then it hit its peak with John Waters in 1977, if you've ever seen Hairspray or lots of his other movies that are so bad they're good. That's what happened there. And then things sped up really quick. You had, in the 80s, you had things like Spike Lee, the first, really prominent black filmmaker to win a lot of awards. Decentralization from Hollywood. You had people like Richard Linklater establishing the film hub in Austin that led to South by Southwest that a lot of us benefit from that came out of this film festival. Sundance, Sex, Lies, and Videotape was the first kind of independent film in the modern era to win a lot of Oscars. The Crying Game, which wasn't revolutionary as a film, but it was 1992 is a year I really like to point out a lot, and it's interesting if any of you guys are watching the O.J. Simpson thing on FX right now, is the internet wasn't quite what it is now, but in 1992 people started talking more from a communication and psychology standpoint, and the reason The Crying Game is such a linchpin is because it's a taboo film. It's still a little hard to watch to this day. But it was the first time that, you might find out that, your great-aunt Fanny had watched The Crying Game, which was really strange, because prior to 92, that just didn't happen with these films. And then you had some other stuff happen until we got to this point, and this is where we're headed, is 1994. So the film industry had a year where everything changed for them, and you had 5 particular things that happened. We'll start on the lower section here with Stargate, which is not a good movie. I don't like it at all. The reason it's on there, Stargate was the first studio film to have an official digital presence. That means that it was the first movie that ever had a website that actually was tied to the movie that belonged to it. It wasn't like a fan site on GeoCities. You had Hoop Dreams, which is a documentary, which was took about a decade to make. It missed the cut by about a year for MTV's Real World, being what kind of shattered people's expectations on what documentaries could be. These were real, regular people doing mundane things towards a larger goal. But if you've never seen it, you've got to watch it. It's unbelievable. But it really changed the way that documentary films were made. You had Clerks, which, how many of you guys have seen that before? Yeah, great movie. $30,000 was the entire budget for this film. The song rights cost more than the actual movie did to get made. Completely changed the way that people made movies, and also kind of sparked that go get a beat-up camera, go make a movie on your own, take it to a festival, and win that, oh, I can do this too mentality. DreamWorks was founded in 1994 as well, which was the first studio founded in 50 years almost. That was Steven Spielberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and David Geffen left the studio system and kind of wedged in this real break in the line that studios have been holding for a long time that kind of kept independent film out. Miramax also got traction at this point. And then you had Pulp Fiction, which was the film, one of the first independent films that had, with Miramax, an Oscar push that you had, kids growing up on corn farms in Iowa discovering independent film. And this film went on to get robbed at the Oscars by Forrest Gump, but completely created a new generation of filmmakers. And what happened was everybody started breaking the rules because people woke up overnight within this 1 to 2 year period, if you talk to film historians, and they started remembering who they were making movies for. If you go back and watch movies from the 80s, there are basically 4 archetypes from the 80s and even dating back to the 70s, and movies were made for marketing. And it got to a point where people started making movies for the sake of making movies again. And you know what? More people wanted to start making them and consuming them. And what ended up happening was a completely new landscape. And very quickly, by 1996, in fact, in 2 years, independent and studio film almost became indistinguishable. Because the trick here is, guess what? Pulp Fiction actually isn't an independent film, even though we all think it is. It was made in the studio system. But it became indistinguishable to the point that 4 of the 5 Best Picture nominees in 1996, the one that wasn't was Braveheart, which still felt very outside of how things were normally made, were independent films. And with that, the entire process changed. The way that films were created, produced, and how people consume them, all of a sudden, people's tastes went from here to here almost overnight within a matter of years. The other result of that is that everyone started being a filmmaker. In 1994, I was a high school student. I started making movies after I saw El Mariachi from Robert Rodriguez because I was like, I can do that. And each year now, tens of thousands of movies are being made. According to YouTube statistics, when you factor in feature films that are released there, in 2014, 50,000 feature films were released. 50,000. In 1985, it was 715. So that tells you the pace that things have picked up just since South by Southwest and stuff came out. All right, that's fine. I talked about it. So what the hell does this have to do with UX, right? So let's run a parallel here. Let's take a look at the nano history of UX for a second. Most of you guys who've been practicing for a while know this history. We had Dreyfus writing Designing for People in the mid-50s, and this kind of was before digital obviously applied. Most of us are in the digital space. But this idea of human-computer and human-machine interaction has been around for 75 years at this point, or 70 years. 1966, Walt Disney established this legacy of what we think of when we think of usability. We think of customer experience, and we think of engaging with people on an emotional level to accomplish an end goal. The innovations that came from that culture that he created, if you look at almost any startup in the Valley, there is DNA of the Disney methodology there. A lot of that thanks to Apple, that has a lot of ties to that thought as, thought as well, that a lot of those people came from there. In 1973, Xerox invented the graphic user interface. If you saw Dr. Nielsen's talk yesterday, I believe that the graphic user interface in the grand history of human-machine interaction, when we look back on this probably 50 to 100 years from now, will be a blip on the radar. The graphic user interaction will be something that we today, a lot of us, our jobs, what we do, revolve around it. I don't know that that's going to be the case in 30 years, maybe, and definitely not in 50. And then things picked up in the 70s and 80s when you had all of these big names that you guys know, until Don Norman actually put the word user experience designer on an HR form, and we all got a job title thanks to him and Apple. And the Polar Bear book comes out in 98. The iPod and Tony Fadell and his team happened in 2001. And then a bunch of us started getting together in a room. I wasn't there in 2003, and started talking at the first digital UX conference in 2003, where people started applying this to the web and what we do. But the culture that existed at that time leading up to 2003 was very similar to the film industry. in that we had big budget enterprise studio type entities and then these small agency projects similar to independent film, but no one really knew what was going on with these smaller shops because the enterprise stuff was really all that anybody talked about. So these are people that worked at IBM and Xerox, or these were the agencies that were very early on in Adaptive Path and IDEO that were getting in with those big companies. But UX wasn't really something that was thought about by the masses or the smaller companies. But we all know that it's not that simple anymore because we had a 1994 in our industry, and this was it. It was 2008. Every time I give this talk, I have to remind myself that this slide is accurate, which blows my mind still, because this is less than 8 years ago, technically, because we're barely into 2016. All of this happened within a 14-month period, and that's crazy to think about. That completely revolutionized the way people raise money and interact with political campaigns online. Instagram and the way that people interact with photography and visual imagery. Twitter technically came out in 2006, but nobody used it after South by Southwest. Everybody used it, abandoned it, and then it actually figured out what it wanted to be in 2008. Android, the App Store. Last.fm existed, but Last.fm didn't work the way that Spotify does, and it didn't work on a mobile device. Spotify did. Foursquare, Pinterest, and Google Maps for the first time, which is crazy to me to think about this. This is true. We didn't have maps on our phones that used GPS before 2008. It feels like that was 30 years ago, but it wasn't. And the result of all of this stuff happening within about a 14-month period is that everyone started breaking the rules. Everybody looked up and remembered who they were making experiences for. This is the unpopular part of this talk. I think I'm at a pretty safe UX conference. This is an academic. But this is the whole, what I consider, there's this idea of UXers, to me, prior to this time period, kind of didn't want people understanding UX outside of the industry. It wasn't really for everybody else because you had to follow all these processes and you had to write a book and have this PhD. And all of a sudden, people were like, no, I get it. I can do that. Because you had all of these Valley startups happening and they were like, usability is the king. Why did Spotify win? Why did the App Store win? Why did so many of these things win? Is because they had better experiences. They were better designed. That's not what the audience looked for. It's that it integrated with what they expected. Going back to the clip from 2001, it was a natural extension of how they like to work day to day. And you know what? The general public started to get it. People's grandmothers started using phrases like, yeah, I like it, but the usability seems a bit off. When you start hearing things like that being said, when people started writing Amazon reviews of products and bringing up phrases like, I don't know if they empathize with me as a user, and the common public started saying things like that and demanding these experiences. And that's what they did. They didn't just demand better experiences. They wanted more usable and more beautiful and more delightful. And we were in trouble because up to this point, UX practitioners had, for the most part, ignored visual design. I don't think it was ignorance. I don't think it was laziness. It's that visual design hadn't caught up. If you go back and you look at what the men and women who worked at IBM and Xerox in the 80s and early 90s struggled with in just compatibility from one chipboard to another within the organization to get a GUI to work, nonetheless, when you put this thing on the web and you can't control how people interact with it, there was a reason that we kept visual design to a minimum for so long. It's because we didn't know how to work with something that we couldn't control, how people interacted with it. But suddenly, that did get easier because of the closed ecosystem of the iPhone. It did get easier because of the fact that Internet Explorer very quickly lost its market share, and you had a much tighter experience at this point with Firefox, Safari, and then eventually Chrome coming out a couple years later. The result of this is that for us, a lot of us, I don't know how long you guys have been in the field. I've been in the field for 18 years, but I didn't know that's what it was called until 2002 because I thought it was web design. But we had been applying cognitive psychology principles, and I have a liberal arts background for 10 years prior to that. And overnight, our process fundamentally changed. My agency fundamentally changed because the way the UX was done, the way it was taught, and how we communicated to people about what we do just came out of nowhere, it felt like. And the result of that is, this is not some grand declaration, feel free to tweet it or whatever. I'm not one of those people. But I think that this is kind of this age of indie UX that we're in right now, and I love it. Because, again, I'm a big fan of independent film. I'm a big fan of saying to 19-year-old African-American kid in inner city Oakland, here's a camera, go make a film, and by God, I hope he wins an Oscar. I think that's awesome. And I think that our industry is capable of having that as well. And I think we've got a really inclusive industry, but I think we've got a long way to go. But the result of that is that we're now in an era of independent practitioners competing with these established firms. You have 10-person agencies or 3-person in-house teams building experiences that almost overnight are valued at $1 billion. You have people who started out as a junior UI designer 2 years out of college with a liberal arts degree find themselves thrust into the middle of deciding how 1 billion people interact with an application like Facebook. This is a very dangerous, exciting, strange, and terrifying time to be doing what we do. Because now everyone is a user experience designer, it seems. And it's tough if you've been doing this for a long time, and you know the steps, and you know the methodology, and you know how this is supposed to work, just like it was for the film industry, to absorb all of these people suddenly coming in and going from 715 feature films to 50,000. And that's where we are right now. Because now it no longer takes a village to create a user experience design. Leah Bewley's book, User Experience Team of One. There are tons of independent practitioners. My friend Sophia in here does it by herself as a UX designer. You can be a single UX generalist, and you can figure out a lot of things on your own without following all these steps, just like a single man or woman can get behind a camera and make a film that wins all of these awards. And most end users can't tell the difference between the two, but I do think the village idiots are making stuff at times as well. Because the ability for buyers and consumers to know the difference is a big difference between the difference that we see, not because we judge what's out there, but because I think there's a lot of bad experiences out there right now that are harming what we do. But just like in any situation, if you have children or however else, screaming at people is not going to solve anything. So it's up to us to kind of accept that this is the reality now, is that a 19-year-old can build something like Yik Yak or Yo or something like that, and all of a sudden be worth $1 billion, and it seems to solve a simple idea, but then the minute stock investors and stuff get involved, they start jamming in features and all that, and it just becomes this thing. It's the Twitter thing. I'm sure, RIP Twitter and all that stuff that you guys are hearing now. What do you expect? It was made by a bunch of people 15 or 12 years ago or whatever it was when they started kicking this idea around that had no consideration for this stuff. And we've got to kind of bring it back a little bit. So how do we get there is, I think this goes back to the crystal ball thing. We've got some stuff we can learn from filmmaking. Because if we want to remain useful to experience design, we've got to change a little bit about how we work. I think the first step in that is really saying that the process isn't as important as the people. This is unpopular. I understand the benefit to process and user experience design. I understand the benefit to roles and silos and specializing in what you do, and I'm not an advocate for generalists to just do everything under the sun, because then everybody's a mile wide and an inch deep. But I find that in the user experience industry, and we find this with our recruiting at 9 Labs, that there is this tendency to say to a person that has a visual design background that wants to become a researcher that they're not necessarily fit for that, or that the expectations are that they fill a certain role, and we don't allow people to kind of find out what they're best at on each individual project and kind of adapt throughout their career. The reason is we have this waterfall process. We think that we're agile, but we're not. Some shops are, but most aren't, because this is how movies were made for a long time. Pre-production was research, production was build, post-production was testing. And then we'll fix it in post as lean UX. No one ever gets that joke. Oh, you got it. Right. Like, no one. Excuse me, I didn't want to cough on the mic for you guys. No one ever gets that joke, but I think it's funny. And this is where the film industry lies a little bit now. So let me back up a little bit on this. Is when we talk about the studio part of the film, is it even out yet? Hail Caesar, the new Coen Brothers film. Has anybody seen it? I haven't seen it yet. I've been here. But, it kind of goes back to that golden age of Hollywood. And what a lot of people don't know is that films used to be made, you had a star. So you had Judy Garland, Ava Gardner, Clark Gable, those kind of people. And then the job of the studio was to go, okay, it's time for Clark to do a movie, go make a movie for Clark. That's how movies were made, right? It was, hey, we should probably do a Roman epic or a biblical epic, or let's do a romance, or let's do a crime drama. Films weren't driven by script and screenplay and ideas. They were driven by the studio, so they were driven by marketing. And that's kind of how user experience design, if you look at this for the most part, is that we look at things and we go, okay, this is what people want, so that's what we're going to make, and then hopefully they'll buy it. What Agile should be is that people look at a situation and they create scenarios for this, and epic stories and tasks that end up through very specific processes get you into a place where you make something that feels like it was made with intention from the beginning. That's whatever methodology you use, capital A Agile, lowercase, lean, whatever else. But this is the part that I think so many people miss, is because they keep just talking about silos. They keep just talking about, oh, this person that does this role is supposed to fit in here. And it's this waterfall process that keeps getting lodged in. When film finally figured this out, I mean, yes, there are, 17 Fast and Furious movies and all that right now, but for the most part, movies are better, right? I mean, we see more films now that move us in ways that was just not possible before. 5 to 10 great movies were made a year prior to the mid-90s, and now it's 50 or 100, honestly. And the result of that is because it's how people made movies. In the past, this is how people thought. And if you guys don't know the history of Alfred Hitchcock was the most totalitarian filmmaker. I mean, if you were 2 minutes late to a call on the set, he would berate you and scream at you. I mean, it was an unhealthy experience. Great filmmaker, but a film was made 3 times: when you write it, when you shoot it, when you edit it. He did not care if you worked 19 hours. He didn't care about efficiency. What he cared about was efficacy, and he cared about those kind of things. And that process, that kind of thinking of doing things over and over again in UX, is why a lot of agencies and a lot of product teams are getting passed by 21-year-olds that are just like, I don't know all the rules, I'm just going to pick up a camera and start filming, and then the public gets it. And we're like, oh my God, we did all these things. Why didn't they follow the idea that we went with? So how do we make this stuff work together? These are just 4 quick tips that I've learned. The rest of the talk is not on this Agile stuff, but I have to get here to get to the rest of it. That we've learned, and this may be old hat to you guys, but if not, this is what I've picked up from my team that's really helped, is if you're building things as a UX team on a product or a service that's getting deployed, you've got to be 2 or 3 sprints ahead. This is the same thing with screenwriting or with anything else with the thinking. I don't know how people do it where the UX team is figuring stuff out while stuff is being built. So we've kind of put a stop to that in how we work. We've also started building in these interstitial dev sprints every 3rd sprint. So 1, 2, 3 interstitial, 1, 2, 3 interstitial. So if it's a 2-week cycle, 6 weeks, 2-week interstitial, 6 weeks, 2-week interstitial, where the back-end team is doing bug squashing and stuff, and if we need that time to get back into our silos and feel all academic, we'll do it for those 2 weeks. But we're focused on shipping stuff. Whenever we work on large teams, most of our development is with in-house teams. We have found that when we want to apply Agile and there's a Scrum Master or anything like that, that they want to write our epics for us. We turn down the work. We write our own epics as a UX team. And we have also learned in our project management app, Teamwork, we create a backlog of ideas to work through while those dev sprints are occurring. These are all things that I picked up from movie making, and the 4th one, for example, this backlog is they keep this history of shots that are like, hey, we need to get these shots at some point, but stand-ins will be fine. We don't need the actors, or it's just B-roll stuff. And when actors are late, or they're setting up a rig, or special effects is doing some work, they'll send second unit out, and they'll knock out 3 or 4 of these things in a day. That's kind of how we look at it with UX as well. So let's talk about our roles and how those relate and what I've learned there. So the director in a film, this is kind of what we think of when we think of a filmmaker, and probably the greatest ever there in that picture is Stanley Kubrick. So the director's job is to provide observation in context. So films are meaningless without the context for the viewer, and good experiences are meaningless without understanding context for the user. So my job, I'm a chief experience officer, director of design, director of UX, whatever you want to call it. I lead a team. For a long time, I thought that that role for me was about looking at the team and spelling out, this is what we're going to do, and kind of doling out to the project management team, this is where we're going to go, this is what we're going to do. And I've had the opportunity to work with 3 Academy Award winners and watch them work. And I've also had the opportunity between some friends to see some other stuff. And the difference between people who make great films and make good films is they do this. They provide context. And when I started learning this as a user experience director, this was fundamental for me. And I want to unpack this because I don't know how many of you guys lead teams. But your responsibility as a leader of a UX team is to provide the context for the makers and the users. You are the person that helps your users understand where you're taking them and helps your people understand how to get them there. Dictation in that process, this idea of telling people what to do step by step by step, is a fine line because context is king. These 4 questions should look really similar to you. Where am I? What am I doing? Who am I? What do I want? These are just parts of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all these other ideologies that we have. These are the exact same questions that a director asks when they provide context. Have you ever, let me say this. Do you know what the difference between a good movie and a bad movie is? Isn't necessarily the plot or the story or anything else. I'm talking about those movies that maybe star 2 to 3 Academy Award winners and the screenwriter's respectable and the director's respectable. And then the film ends up getting a 40 on Rotten Tomatoes and you start asking yourself, like, why was this movie bad? The science of that you can boil it down to is that they don't have context. That is the one thing that's missing between a good film and a great film. The story can be something that has nothing to do with what you're interested in doing in your life. It's the fact that you are not able to align your emotion and your feeling with what they're trying to get across to you. So by asking these questions over and over again, this is what your job is to do as a director, is to constantly pull your team back in and say, as the UX lead, you've got to shape the vision for the project and be a persistent voice of context to everybody involved and go, hey, I know that's cool. I know we can do that. I know that's what the reports are telling us. But what does that say about context? What does it say about our vision? What does it say about where we're going? So for me, some lessons that I've learned from that is I always reframe toward the audience. There's a difference between empathy, I think, and this idea of context. And empathy is very important. I'm not a researcher day to day. But what I mean by that is empathy only gets you so far in, yes, I understand all of those things. But if you do nothing with them, if they're sitting around in empathy maps and documents, then they're kind of useless. So as a leader on that team, it's your job to constantly realign everybody to understand that and get focused on that audience. And then do a few other things, including mediate creative differences and just work a certain way. So to break that down, I want to take a look at 2 archetypes of directors. So the first one is Wes Anderson. I love Wes Anderson. I love his movies. Has everybody seen a Wes Anderson movie? You know who he is? No? People don't? Okay. His most recent film was the Grand Budapest Hotel. He's known for films Rushmore, the movie I showed the clip from earlier. A lot of Bill Murray stuff in his films, so Bill Murray. What he's known for is, people say at times his films are twee. They're a little bit overblown. He is a research-driven director. He conducts extensive research to create immersive experiences. His films feel very authentic to the point of being annoying. One of my friends is a typographer who's done work for him a couple times, and she shares the story of how they spent $40,000 printing letterpress hotel brochures for the Grand Budapest Hotel to lay around on the set. They're not even visible on camera, but they're authentically letterpressed for the era in which the film took place. And the reason that he does that is because his job is to use existing patterns and worlds to make things feel familiar, and he does this for the people doing the work, not the audience. If you see an interview with Wes Anderson, he's a nice guy, he's not a jerk, but he would tell you in no uncertain terms, I don't make these movies for you. I make these movies for me and my cast, and I hope you like it. So that's his methodology. That is one way to approach user experience design. This is the way things are supposed to work. This is the idea. This is the best experience. We're going to make it, and hopefully the audience adopts it. It's not ignoring empathy. It's not ignoring what people want or desire. But it's that, yeah, but you guys like cheese puffs and these kind of things, and maybe you're not the smartest people in the world, so we're going to make some decisions for you. That's not condescending. At times we have to be like that, right? At times we have to just say, this is the way we're going to do it. I think for Wes, what I've learned from watching him is in order for that to be successful, the one thing that stands out to me is he consistently works with the same cast and crew because they believe in that same process. If you're a freelance designer or you're in a firm that constantly shifts, it's really hard to have this methodology of a group of people that come around and go, hey, we believe this is best and we're going to build things that go this way. Through my external observation, this is what I think IDEO does really well. If you guys look up to them, I think that they do this where they kind of build an experience and they're like, this is how it's going to work, and we're going to go from there. So Wes's films can't be classified because they're for him and his cast. So they don't really fit into this like, hey, it's this genre, it's a comedy or whatever else. They don't really care, much like an experience could be something that's, we don't really know what the purpose of this is. You figure it out and use it for what you want. A messaging app is a good example of that. A few things I've learned from him is you work with people who get you. If you're going to be obsessive about something, don't half-ass it. Be obsessive. Immersion works as long as you do it well, so your whole team's got to be immersive, and you got to know your history. So his polar opposite is a guy named Michael Bay, who it's a very fitting photo of Michael Bay on the set of Transformers. So he is known for movies like The Rock and Transformers, and he has these new ones on the Benghazi soldiers and stuff, and he's a lunatic. So he is known for building new worlds that defy reality to his own liking, and he creates something new, but it feels very familiar. He is known for making exactly what you want as an audience, to the point of it being like the Wu-Tang name generator, where they just put a bunch of film stuff in and they spit out a film script and they're like, people will buy $400 million of tickets worth of that, and then they just make it and go make it. They don't think about that. That's how a lot of user experience designs get made, right? That's how a lot of products, a lot of the stuff you see on Product Hunt gets made right now is like, people will use the heck out of that because surely we need one more photo manipulation app. The thing about him is he works with the best resources for his immediate need and isn't concerned about the overall impact. My friend Coles works for him as a second unit director on 8 films, and he fires him every time and then hires him back at least twice. He's just known for that. That's how he works. He doesn't typically work with the same actors other than Nicolas Cage, because who wouldn't? Everything that he makes is for the audience and the user. He doesn't really care what it takes to get there. He's driven by those overall things. And his work can't be classified because it's for everybody. So these are the kind of things that, you know what, I'm going to make it this way and you guys are going to like it. And he's okay with that. So some things I've learned from him is if you want to build things this way, if you want to build things where it's like, hey, we're motivated by awards and Silicon Valley Drive and we really don't care about the empathy and the immersion, that's okay. That's what you want to build. But you got to hire the best people. They're going to get you exactly where you want and fire them if you can't. If they can't get you there, don't back off of that. If you halfway do this, then you just make bad stuff that's half-baked. Build what you know works and don't worry about what critics say. So if you're like, I don't care if people are going to judge us for what this is, we're just going to build it and ship it anyway, and go big. I bring them up as archetypes because I think both serve a purpose, because they both create experiences that some people enjoy and others can't stand. But as the director, again, providing context, the world we see is not the world as it is. So, this person is responsible. Their role, directors and UX leads, they take us to new worlds. That's their job. That's the job with what we make. I think a lot of times we get so focused on accomplishing tasks, and I think that, when we get into artificial intelligence and other stuff like that, that's a lot of what we focus on. But you know what? Our audience hasn't caught up to that yet. They've just now, in the last 7 or 8 years, gotten hot to the idea of user experience design, of something not basically being this fundamental ... do this thing. We've just now warmed them up to the idea of delight, and we're kind of already starting to get away from letting them just kind of have fun with stuff, I think, as the industry's grown. Because people have different needs, different audiences, different teams, different goals, different outcomes, and that's okay, because different people like different things, is what I've learned. So we've learned at our team, when we do user research, we don't ask people what they want. That's how we end up with holiday-themed rom-coms like the SNL joke one I think is like Boxing Day. There's like all these Valentine's Day and stuff movies are terrible. And Adam Sandler keeps making movies, I don't know how. But if you ask people what they want, that's what they'll tell you. And we make what they need. And that's how we end up with movies like Mad Max Fury Road and Guardians of the Galaxy, that on paper you're like, why the hell are somebody giving them $100 million? And then it ends up being one of the best movies I've ever seen. So as a user experience design team, you've got to have an additional set of roles on your team as a director that help you get there and understand this stuff. So a couple other people that we learned from. The editor is your usability lead. My usability lead on my team, I always tell her I feel like she just cuts everything I love into pieces. This person kind of just has to be this person that gets people from A to Z. So they get the audience, they understand it, they often, and it's me as a director, they have to be like, hey, thanks for providing context, but we got to ship something today, and it's also got to meet all of these needs and these requirements, and hopefully it's delightful along the way. But when you work with this person, you got to be prepared to take a beating, because just like with an editor, they may cut out your favorite scene. Your usability lead is going to got to make sense of everything and say no to stuff. So this is how we keep people from just randomly making 14-hour art house films, is we have editors. The writer is the information architect. It seems like a duh analogy, but it's actually not, because what I found is that this idea of they create structures for communication and they forecast actions with words. The first time I heard this, I was like, that's what an IA is? I was like mind blown, because I always think of IA as, you know, navigation and sitemaps and structures and all that stuff. But no, they forecast actions with words. And I was like, what does that mean? But the more and more I think about it, it's like, yes, that's what they're doing, because you know how things are going to work through those words and through that structure. And I think this is a role that we've kind of just like, similar to the film industry, they just kind of kicked the writer out for a long time, and now they've brought him back. Is I love that IA is starting to come back around again, that it's not just part of UX, that the standalone IA is coming back, much like the screenwriter. We learn a lot of stuff from them to just know where you're going and learn all this stuff from them. Last couple is the actor, which is the content. They get all the credit. They're what people look at, and they're insufferable. You can't do anything with them, so what do? You hire a casting director, which is a content strategist, who can control them to a degree, or at least manage them, because there's nothing you can do about your content. And content strategists can just deal with unruly actors, unruly content, and keep them offset. A couple other ones that I like, analogies that we've learned, that our pre-production team is our research team. A lot of times we insert research a little bit too late, or they think that they are still making the movie after we moved on. Continuity expert is a project manager. You know what a continuity expert is in a film? That's the person, like, whenever you see a film and you're like, the guy's hair is parted to the left, then they go away on camera, and then it's parted to the right, or shirt's a different color, his jacket's off. You have a person on the set that their job is just to ensure that that happens. They're constantly taking pictures and stuff. It's fascinating if you've ever seen it done. It's got to be the most stressful job in the world. I worked on a massive action film with like 32 key cast members, and I felt so sorry for that woman. I don't know how she did her job. I think she died after that movie was over. But your production designers, your UI designer. This is one of my favorites. So production designers, I know a lot of production designers by names, like my favorite films, like Blade Runner, but most people don't. And I think that UI designers get a little frustrated at times because they think they're the director or whatever. I don't know, but you kind of have to bring them back down to that role at times. Like, no, you're just a production designer. You're just about how things are supposed to look and be pretty. And this is what I do, really. I'm the producer, the creative director, more than the UX lead now. I get all the credit for just pointing at stuff, basically, which is what the producer does. So I'll wrap up with these little quick cuts. So do any of you guys use material design in your projects? You do? Okay, well, I won't be offensive. So the Marvel Cinematic Universe is this thing, if you know the Marvel movies and stuff, they have this system for like, hey, this is how you make a movie, and basically here's this box that you live in as a director. That's kind of what I think material design is. I would not go try to make Pride and Prejudice in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so don't try to make a thing that doesn't apply to Android with material design, is my point. Make short films. This is something I learned to figure all this stuff out. We do a lot of side projects and small ideas as a UX team. Still focus on a lot of that stuff. The same way that the film industry, I've learned from them. If you got an idea or a concept, some of the best science fiction films right now were actually short films that somebody put out as a proof of concept to see if it would work, and then did the full film instead of going out and spending $200 million. Try that stuff with your own products. Make your own Hollywood. I'm in Atlanta. I'm not in New York or San Francisco. Atlanta's not a small town, but I always tell people, just like Austin, you don't have to move to Hollywood to make movies. You can do it in Des Moines, Iowa. That's fine. I think this is a perfect generation to be doing this stuff, for us to fix how we do things right now. So, just be open, be welcoming, and let people in, but also understand your role in your process. Don't make useless sequels. I don't need to see Alvin and the Chipmunks Part 5. So let's stop making so many safe options and explore these things. When I mean by that, don't play it safe. And thanks. Cool. I don't know if you guys have another talk in 15 minutes or lunch. What's next? I don't know. Yeah, break and lunch. So cool. Well, thank you guys for listening. I hope that was fun, and we'll see you around. They have some copies of my book, which has nothing to do with this talk, out at the table. It's called Creative Truth. So it's on how to start and build a profitable design business. So if you have like a consultancy or something like that, and you want to read my horror stories on everything I did wrong for 5 years, and then how we fixed it and built a pretty successful consultancy, I've got a book. It actually doesn't come out for 2 weeks, so these are like ahead of the curve. It's like getting into a premiere. I don't know. I will sign them, even though that's weird for me if somebody wants me to, but they have them at the bookstore, and I'll hang out over there. So thanks.